Okay, let's jump straight in. We have this stack of sources here, articles, reports,
Yep.
analyses, all about a topic that feels, well, more urgent than ever, Iran's nuclear program.
Right.
We're looking specifically at the latest findings from the IAEA, Iran's current technical muscle, and how this all plays out globally.
Exactly. Think of this as your shortcut, really. Our job here is to cut through all that material and pull out the most important insights, maybe the surprising nuggets you might miss, just to get you well informed on the critical point this program's reached right now.
So where did this all begin? I mean, it wasn't always
Yeah.
the big international issue it is now, right?
No, exactly. Our sources, well, they trace it back surprisingly far, the 1950s, actually, under the U.S. Atoms for Peace program, believe it or not.
Atoms for Peace, huh?
Yeah. You had the Tehran Nuclear Research Center opening in '67 with American help. Iran even signed the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, back in 1970.
Which is supposed to stop non-nuclear states getting weapons.
That's the idea. But what's fascinating looking at the sources is how quickly ambitions grew under the Shah in the '70s.
Really?
Yeah. Plans for something like 23 nuclear power stations by 2000. I mean, that's a huge number. And he was interested in reprocessing technology.
Which gets you plutonium, the other bomb pad.
Exactly. Plus, pursuing nuclear-capable missiles around the same time. It was, ambitious.
And even back then, the alarm bells were, well, they weren't silent, were they? Quietly ringing, maybe?
Yeah, pretty much. Our sources note U.S. intelligence saw the planned capacity was just way beyond Iran's actual domestic needs.
Okay.
The State Department apparently concluded Iran's motives were, quote, not entirely clear, seemed driven partly by maybe wanting nuclear weapons.
So that ambiguity, that question mark over intentions, it's not new at all.
Not at all. It has really deep roots. Then, bang, the 1979 revolution. A massive turning point.
Right. Western cooperation just stops.
Dries up completely, forces Iran underground, basically, looking for alternative, often secret pathways. And this is where the AQ Khan connection comes in. The illicit network.
Mid-80s. Yeah, absolutely critical. Through Khan, Iran gets the IR-1 gas centrifuge technology, that first-generation machine.
Okay.
That was the key moment, that allowed them to start developing their own enrichment capability, pretty much in secret.
And the world doesn't really get a proper look until, what, 2002?
Yeah, exactly, 2002.
Yeah.
That's when these dissidents revealed the Natanz enrichment plant and the Arak heavy water reactor. That forced the IAEA to open investigations into these undeclared sites.
Right.
But what the source material really highlights, and this is just a vital piece of context, is that 2002 wasn't the start of the secret program. It explicitly states that for nearly 20 years, Iran pursued much of its sensitive nuclear work in secret.
20 years, back to the early 80s.
Right back to the early 1980s, just after the revolution. So this isn't just about, recent noncompliance with the JCPOA. It's a long-standing pattern, deception, hidden work.
Wow.
It means the challenges today are really rooted in decades of these secret practices. Okay, decades of secret work before anyone really caught on that historical context is...
Well, it's crucial.
So, bringing us up to today, the big question is, what can Iran actually do now? What's the capability?
Well, the technical capabilities have just escalated dramatically, particularly uranium enrichment. They're enriching way, way beyond the 3.67% limit that was in the JCPOA deal.
And the number we keep seeing, the one that really raises eyebrows, is 60% U-235 purity.
Exactly. That's a critical threshold. International Atomic Energy officials are very clear in the sources. 60% has no credible civilian use. None.
Right.
And it's only a very short technical step away from weapons grade 90%. Think of it like, I don't know, 90% of the effort is already done. It's highly concentrated.
And the amount they have now is quite something. The sources say as of May 17, 2025, their stockpile of 60% HEU, highly enriched uranium, hit 408.6 kilograms.
Yeah, and that's a jump of over 133 kilos in just 3 months before that. And that 408.6 kilogram number is significant because, as the sources state, that quantity is theoretically enough for multiple atomic bombs if they decide to enrich it further to 90%.
And their total stockpile, all enrichment levels.
Massive. Over 9,200 kilograms as of that May date.
The sources also really make a point of saying Iran is the only non-nuclear weapon state enriching uranium to 60%.
Which just underscores how unusual and frankly concerning this is from a non-proliferation perspective. They're doing this enrichment, particularly the 60% stuff, at the Fordo fuel enrichment plant.
Fordo, right.
Using interconnected cascades of their advanced IR-6 centrifuges. And that setup running on 20% enriched uranium feed, well, it can be very quickly modified to pump out weapons-grade material.
And talking about centrifuges, they started with that old IR-1 from the Khan network, but now it's a whole different ballgame, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. They've developed multiple generations of advanced machines, IR-2 meters, IR-4, IR-6, even testing IR-8s and 9s.
How many are we talking about?
As of February 2025, nearly 17,000 centrifuges installed. And the advanced models, they make up about 2/3 of the total enrichment capacity. That's the key. The new ones are just much faster.
And they're still adding more.
Yep. Plans mentioned in the sources include rolling out more IR-2 meters and installing a huge cascade of over 1,100 IR-6s. So the capability isn't static, it's growing rapidly.
And doing the 60% enrichment at Fordo? That location isn't random, is it? It's the one built into a mountain, deeply buried.
That's a critical strategic detail the sources highlight. Its location makes it more challenging to destroy with conventional military strikes. It's about ensuring the program's survivability, its resilience, especially for that highest level enrichment, against any potential attack.
Okay, so that's the uranium pathway, very advanced. What about the other route? Plutonium from heavy water reactors, Iraq.
Right, there's the original IR-40 reactor at Eric. Its initial design, well, it was capable of producing plutonium for maybe 1 or 2 weapons a year.
But the JCPOA made them change it.
Correct. It required a redesign. It's now called the IR-20, or KHRR, specifically to prevent weapons-grade plutonium production. And the spent fuel has to be shipped out of the country.
When's that likely to be running?
Commissioning. Maybe 2025. Full operation, perhaps 2026, according to the sources.
But the sources mention a new reactor, too, at Esfahan.
Yes, a new 10-megawatt research reactor, the IR-10. It's designed to use fuel enriched up to nearly 20%. Now, while it's declared for civilian research, there are concerns.
Concerns like?
Well, that it could help Iran build up its knowledge and capabilities in handling and, potentially down the line, separating plutonium, so effectively opening or maybe enhancing that second pathway to fissile material.
Okay, so all this speed, this capability, it brings us to the concept of breakout time. Maybe just clarify that again, and where things actually stand now.
Sure. Breakout time is basically the theoretical minimum time Iran would need to produce enough weapons-grade fissile material, either uranium or plutonium, for one nuclear weapon, starting from wherever they are today.
And a key goal of the JCPOA was to push that out to at least a year, gave everyone breathing room.
Exactly.
So where are they now?
The sources assess that breakout time effectively reached 0 by June 2022.
0. That sounds pretty concerning.
It is. It means that the technical capacity to produce the material is now measured in weeks, maybe even days.
Weeks or days?
Yeah. As of September 2024, the IAEA and the E3 countries estimated Iran already had enough HEU for 4 nuclear devices if they enriched it further.
4 devices worth?
And U.S. intelligence assesses they have the infrastructure and experience to quickly produce weapons-grade uranium. Some U.S. officials have estimated production time in as little as 1 week. The CIA director used the phrase, a week or a little more.
Okay, now we need to be clear here. The sources also state that U.S. intelligence currently assesses Iran is not currently pursuing the development of a nuclear device. They aren't actually building the bomb itself right now.
That's a really crucial distinction, yes. However, the sources immediately add the caveat that Iran's activities since 2020 better position it to produce a nuclear device if it chooses to do so.
So they've crossed the big technical hurdles for the material.
Pretty much. And we know from Iran's own nuclear archive documents, the stuff Israel seized in 2018, the Atomic Archive, that by 2003, Iran had already made substantial progress in almost all other aspects of nuclear weaponization.
Weaponization meaning?
Things like the actual weapon design, the initiator components, the detonation systems, even doing cold testing, which is testing components without fissile material.
So they had the blueprint and a lot of the non-nuclear parts figured out years ago. And now they have the capability for the fissile fuel itself.
Precisely. The technical barriers, the knowledge gaps for weaponization, actually building the bomb once you have the material, seem to be rapidly diminishing, if they weren't already largely overcome based on that archive evidence.
Which means?
It means the primary remaining hurdle, according to the analysis in these sources, is a political decision by Iran's leadership. And the fact that there's increasing public discussion within Iran about potentially developing nuclear weapons, well, that's noted as a signal that this political calculation might be shifting.
Okay, given this picture advanced tech, near zero breakout, how is the international community, specifically the IAEA, the nuclear watchdog, actually able to keep tabs on all this?
Well, okay, Iran signed the NPT back in 1970, so they have legal obligations under their Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, the CSA, which came into force in 74.
Right.
They also signed something called the Additional Protocol, or AP, in 2003. That significantly expands the IAEA's inspection authority, lets inspectors into more places, quicker notice. They implemented the AP voluntarily for periods.
But the IAEA's main job under the NPT and the Basic Safeguards Agreement is mainly about verifying declared nuclear material and activities, isn't it?
That's the key limitation, yeah. Their legal power to investigate potential weapons work, the weaponization stuff we just talked about, is constrained absent some nexus to nuclear material. If the work doesn't directly involve nuclear material, it's much harder for the IAEA to probe under standard safeguards.
And things got a lot harder for the IAEA starting February 2021.
Oh, they did. Massively harder. That's when Iran stopped implementing its JCPOA commitments. Critically, that included stopping the additional protocol and other key monitoring arrangements that were part of the deal.
And they kicked out some inspectors, too.
Yeah, they withdrew the designation of several experienced IAEA inspectors, which definitely limited the agency's expertise on the ground.
So the consequence is blind spots.
Huge blind spots. The IAEA can't access certain key supporting facilities like centrifuge workshops, component manufacturing sites. They can't fully account for critical materials like centrifuge parts or uranium or concentrate. They're prevented from doing short notice inspections at certain places.
Which means
The sources say these actions have detrimental implications for the IAEA's ability to provide credible assurance that Iran's program is actually peaceful and that material isn't being secretly diverted somewhere else.
the IAEA has also used some pretty strong language about its investigations into Iran's past undeclared work, haven't they?
They have. They've declared an impasse, that's the word they use, an impasse in resolving these outstanding safeguards issues. These issues relate to findings of undeclared nuclear material and activities, stuff Iran just hasn't provided satisfactory technical explanations for, some going back years.
And you mentioned this impasse isn't just like bureaucratic delays from Iran's side.
No, absolutely not. It's explicitly characterized in the source material as a deliberate political choice by Iran
Good choice, too.
to withhold information, basically, not providing real answers. By doing that, Iran keeps this ambiguity around its past activities and maybe even current ones. And that ambiguity, they seem to calculate, boosts their perceived deterrent value against enemies and gives them leverage in any talks.
Oh.
Well, they can always offer more cooperation on these investigations as a future bargaining chip, while actively blocking a full accounting right now that might expose sensitive stuff about past weaponization work or their current capabilities. It's described as a calculated strategy of non-cooperation.
Okay, this dive into the IAEA's challenges and Iran's calculated non-cooperation really sets the stage for the findings
Yeah.
in that May 2025 IAEA report. That seemed to confirm some pretty big, long-held suspicions.
It really did. That report was a critical escalation in the IAEA's official findings. It concluded not just that Iran carried out secret nuclear activities with material not declared at 3 specific sites, but more significantly that these activities were part of an undeclared structured nuclear program carried out by Iran until the early 2000s that used undeclared material.
Okay, undeclared structured nuclear program. That sounds much more significant than just finding, a few stray particles somewhere.
It absolutely is. It's essentially confirming the existence of an organized, concealed program, one with weaponization dimensions that operated secretly for years. The report gets into details about findings at 4 specific sites the IAEA has been investigating for a while. We should probably break down what they found because each piece adds to this picture.
Okay, let's do it.
All right, first, Levisan Xi'an. Now, the site itself was physically demolished after 2003. But the IAEA's technical assessment, based on environmental samples and other intel, is that undeclared drilling and processing of natural uranium happened there. And crucially, that undeclared nuclear material was used there.
So even though they bulldozed the site, the science, the evidence points to past nuclear material activity.
Correct. Then there's Veriman. Here, they found evidence pointing towards an undeclared pilot-scale plant that operated from about 1999 to 2003, doing uranium processing and milling.
Also undeclared.
Also undeclared. Again, most buildings were demolished later, in 2004. But samples taken by the IAEA much later, in 2020, found man-made uranium particles consistent with those conversion activities. Iran denies it, hasn't explained it adequately.
Okay, evidence of undeclared processing. What about Maravan? That one sounded like it related more directly to weaponization work.
Yeah, Maravan is interesting. The evidence found there was consistent with explosive experiments with protective shielding, shielding specifically designed for neutron detectors.
Neutron detector. Okay.
And depleted uranium particles were also found. Now, the IAEA's technical assessment is that nuclear material was planned to be used in undeclared activities at this site. It's worth noting the IAEA now considers the specific issue of Maravan no longer outstanding based on some recent explanations from Iran. But that underlying technical finding that nuclear material was planned for use in these explosive experiments, that remains unchanged.
Explosive experiments shielding for neutron detection. That sounds very much like research related to nuclear weapon physics, doesn't it?
It certainly points in that direction, yes. And finally, there's Turkuzabad.
Turkuzabad, right.
This site was assessed as basically a storage location for nuclear material or equipment related to the program. Satellite imagery showed scraping and landscaping activity in 2018. Looks like an attempt to alter the site, sanitize it maybe?
And did they find anything?
Yes. Samples taken in 2019 found man-made uranium particles, including isotopically altered low-enriched uranium, stuff containing U-236, and also slightly depleted uranium. The IAEA concluded that containers stored there definitely held nuclear material or heavily contaminated equipment. And crucially, they found evidence that some of these containers were removed intact from the site before the IAEA got there and taken to an unknown location.
Removed intact to an unknown location. And Iran's explanation.
They deny storing anything nuclear there and haven't accounted for where those dismantled containers went.
So putting it all together, undeclared processing at labs and environment, planned use of nuclear material in explosive experiments at Maravan, stored nuclear material or contaminated equipment moved from Turkuzabad to who knows where. The significance isn't just the individual findings, is it?
No, not at all. It's the confirmation of a deliberate, organized, secret program, one with clear weaponization dimensions that was operating for years.
They kept hidden.
Exactly. It fundamentally reinforces this picture of a long-term strategy of deception by Iran regarding its nuclear activities, and that they actively concealed elements related to potential weaponization. This confirmation from the IAEA, it just makes future verification incredibly difficult and, well, trust almost impossible to build.
Okay, this history, the current capabilities, the IAEA confirmation of past secret work, it all brings us back to the deal that was supposed to manage this. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. What's its legacy now? What actually happened to it?
Right, the JCPOA, signed in 2015 between Iran and the P5+1 countries US, UK, France, Germany, Russia, China. It really was a landmark agreement at the time.
And the basic trade-off was?
Severe limitations on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for significant sanctions relief.
And those technical limits were pretty strict, weren't they?
They were, yeah. Iran agreed to enrich uranium only up to 3.67%. Keep its stockpile below 202 kilograms, operate only about 5,000 of those older IR-1 centrifuges at Natanz, stop enrichment entirely at Fordo, and, as we mentioned, redesign the Iraq reactor to prevent plutonium production.
And the main goal was pushing that breakout time out to at least a year.
That was the central aim, yes. Along with what the sources call unprecedented intrusive monitoring by the IAEA to verify it all. It was also backed by a UN Security Council resolution and had sunset clauses dates when some restrictions would expire, like October 2025 for some key ones.
But then, May 2018. Big change.
Huge change. The U.S. withdrew from the deal under the Trump administration.
Even though reports at the time said Iran was complying.
Correct. The IAEA and others were reporting Iranian compliance with the deal's terms at that point. After withdrawing, the U.S. launched its maximum pressure campaign, reimposing harsh sanctions.
Which, the sources note, really hurt Iran's economy, but ultimately failed to compel Iran to abandon its nuclear program. Didn't achieve that goal.
No. And it's worth maybe stepping back for a second to look at the JCPOA's own weaknesses, which the sources discuss. These kind of contributed to where we are now.
Like what?
Well, it wasn't comprehensive, right? It didn't address Iran's ballistic missiles or its regional proxy activities, which were big concerns for some. It had those sunset clauses, meaning the restrictions weren't permanent.
Politically difficult, too, in the U.S.
Very. It was done via executive order, not a treaty, making it vulnerable to shifts between administrations. And there was this perception, certainly in Iran, of an imbalance. Iran felt it dismantled key parts of its program up front, while the U.S. only suspended sanctions that could easily be snapped back into place. These flaws made the deal fragile, almost regardless of who broke compliance first.
And Iran's response to the U.S. withdrawal wasn't immediate, but it was phased noncompliance, starting about a year later, May 2019.
Exactly. They began systematically breaching the JCPOA's limits, enriching to higher and higher levels, installing those advanced centrifuges, growing their stockpile way beyond the limit, now 30 times the limit, and resuming enrichment activities at Fordo, step by step.
So the irony here, which the sources point out, is that the U.S. withdrawal, arguably intended to halt or roll back the program, actually ended up triggering the very escalation it was supposed to prevent.
That's the critical consequence highlighted again and again in the sources. The U.S. action directly triggered Iran's rapid escalation and noncompliance. It had this unintended and deeply counterproductive consequence of bringing Iran significantly closer to a nuclear weapons capability than it was under the deal itself.
What about the sanctions relief part and that snapback mechanism? How does that fit in now?
Right, snapback. The JCPOA included this mechanism to automatically reimpose UN sanctions if Iran was found to be in significant noncompliance.
And the Trump administration tried to use it.
They did, controversially, after withdrawing from the deal. But that move was largely rejected by other UN Security Council members. They argued the U.S. didn't have the legal standing to trigger snapback once it was no longer a participant in the JCPOA.
So that failed.
Yeah.
And the original UN sanctions, the nuclear-related ones, they actually expired last year, October 2023.
That's correct. October 18th, 2023. That was called Transition Day under the original deal timeline. However, the E3 France, Germany, and the UK, they declared that Iran's consistent and severe noncompliance meant they wouldn't lift their sanctions pressure.
So what do they do?
They effectively transferred the nuclear-related sanctions that were under UN Resolution 2231 into their own domestic laws. They said they remained committed to preventing Iran getting a weapon and, crucially, stated they would still use the snapback mechanism if necessary.
So snapback is still technically on the table, from the E3's perspective at least, but it's become really complicated and politically loaded.
Very much so. It's become a major point of international friction and a potential flashpoint. Some analysis in the sources suggests that the E3 publicly threatening snapback might even be counterproductive right now, potentially risking talks or hardening Iran's position.
How so?
Because Iran has made counterthreats hinting they might withdraw from the NPT altogether if snapback is triggered. That would be a worst-case scenario, eliminating all international oversight. So it really highlights the deep divisions among the key international players on how best to handle this whole situation.
Okay, this fragmented international picture brings us to the really complex geopolitical implications. How are different global and regional players responding? Let's start with the U.S. stance under the current administration, which one source calls Trump 2.0.
Yeah, so the previous Biden administration had tried to restore the JCPOA, but those talks stalled out in 2022. Under the current administration, there's a reported shift. They seem to be aiming for a completely new deal, termed a verified nuclear peace agreement.
And there's been direct outreach. President Trump to Supreme Leader Khamenei. That's pretty unusual.
It is a notable shift, yeah. Signaling perhaps a willingness for some kind of dialogue. However, this sits right alongside a continuation of the maximum pressure rhetoric and explicit threats of military action if diplomacy ultimately fails.
Mixed messages then.
Definitely. And mixed messages on enrichment, too. Sometimes demanding a complete ban, other times maybe hinting that some limited, highly monitored enrichment might be acceptable in a future deal. It's not entirely clear.
And reports suggest the current talks, such as they are very narrowly focused. Just the nuclear program.
That seems to be the case, yes. Deliberately excluding Iran's broader regional security activities, missiles, proxy groups trying to tackle the nuclear issue in isolation for now.
There was also that interesting detail about President Trump reportedly advising Israeli PM Netanyahu to hold off on military strikes, give diplomacy a chance.
Yes, that was mentioned in the sources, telling Israel to defer potential strikes to allow these diplomatic efforts time to play out.
So there's this real tension in the U.S. approach, trying diplomacy, but keeping the pressure and military threats very visible. What does the analysis say about the effect of that?
The analysis suggests this creates a pretty fundamental contradiction, and it deeply undermines trust, especially from Iran's perspective.
Because of the JCPOA withdrawal.
Exactly. The mixed messages, the coercive tactics coming after the U.S. unilaterally pulled out of the JCPOA, which Iran saw as a major betrayal, has created what the sources call a profound trust deficit for Tehran. They're incredibly wary of signing up to any new deal that could just be torn up again by a future administration.
Right.
So this paradox, as it's described, makes achieving any kind of durable, verifiable agreement exceptionally difficult.
Okay. What about the European powers, the E3? What's their role?
Well, they've consistently tried to keep the JCPOA alive, try to encourage Iran to come back into compliance. They've expressed serious concern over all the escalations. And as we said, they transferred the UN sanctions into their domestic systems when those expired.
And they're considering action at the IAEA.
Sources suggest Western powers, including the E3, are preparing to push the IAEA Board of Governors to formally declare Iran in breach of its non-proliferation obligations under its safeguards agreements. That would be the first time since 2005.
That sounds like a significant escalation itself.
It would be, yeah.
Yeah.
A move that could have pretty serious repercussions. But again, there's this perceived risk noted in the sources that the E3 making public threats about snapback or taking the strong line at the IAEA could actually backfire. It might derail the ongoing quiet diplomacy and just provoke a more confrontational stance from Tehran.
Where do Russia and China fit into all this?
Well, Russia's in a bit of a complex spot. Lifting sanctions on Iran isn't necessarily great for their economy competition, but the alternative, a diplomatic collapse leading to military action and regional chaos, is much worse for them.
So their preferred outcome is?
Seems to be for the U.S.-Iran talks to just kind of continue indefinitely without necessarily reaching a final resolution that could destabilize things. Russia has played constructive roles before, like taking Iran's spent fuel under the JCPOA, and could potentially act as an intermediary again.
And China.
China, usually alongside Russia, consistently opposes resolutions that are highly critical of Iran at the IAEA. This reflects their shared interest, it seems, in maintaining diplomatic flexibility and avoiding anything that could really escalate towards military conflict in the region.
Okay, let's shift to the key regional actors.
Yeah.
Israel's position seems consistently firm.
Absolutely. Israel has extremely deep concerns, as you'd expect. They view Iran's enrichment to 60% as having no civilian justification whatsoever. They see it as clear proof Iran is determined to get the bomb.
And their stance on action.
They've consistently threatened military action against Iran's nuclear facilities. They maintain a hard, zero-enrichment red line for any deal they could accept. And they strongly assert their right to act independently to protect themselves, regardless of what international diplomacy achieves or doesn't achieve.
What about Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states? They're right there in the neighborhood.
They are highly alarmed by the risk of regional instability, of potential conflict spilling over. Saudi Arabia, interestingly, has become quite actively engaged in diplomacy recently. Reports suggest they've been urging Iranian officials to take U.S. offers seriously, trying to help avert a war with Israel.
And the other Gulf states.
They've also reportedly privately expressed their opposition to potential U.S. or Israeli military strikes on Iran to American officials. They really don't want a regional war.
And then there was that surprising proposal from Iran itself.
Yeah.
A joint enrichment facility with Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
Yeah, that proposal, mentioned in the sources, is fascinating. It signals a potential shift in regional dynamics, maybe suggesting a pragmatic shared interest in finding ways to avoid conflict, even on something as sensitive as enrichment.
The sources also connect the nuclear program directly to Iran's wider strategy in the region, right?
Yes, very clearly, especially in the current climate of heightened tensions. Iran views the program as both a crucial bargaining chip in any negotiations and as a powerful deterrent against adversaries like Israel and the United States.
And the critical implication flowing from that is that any military action, whether targeting nuclear sites or maybe Iran's regional proxies, could trigger something much bigger.
Exactly. A wider, highly unpredictable regional conflict. The sources even warn this could potentially involve transnational terrorism, including the use of sleeper cells. The nuclear issue isn't in a vacuum. It's part of this really complex, interconnected security mess where actions in one area can have dangerous ripple effects everywhere else.
And the environment post-October 7, 2023, seems to have made those regional dynamics even more complex.
It definitely has. You see Saudi Arabia trying mediation, Gulf states pushing back against strikes, Iran floating ideas like joint enrichment. These actions suggest a departure from some previous alignments. It introduces a really complex new dimension because the interests of these regional actors might not perfectly line up with the U.S. or Israel anymore.
Okay, so looking at this whole picture, the advanced capability, the verification mess, the fractured international response, that huge trust deficit, what are the actual prospects for some kind of diplomatic resolution right now? Are there any?
Well, the formal talks aimed at reviving the JCPOA, they've been stalled since summer 2022. But importantly, unofficial and indirect talks are continuing. Quietly, in places like Oman, maybe Rome.
And how's it going? Any progress?
Reports describe it as some but not conclusive progress. That's the phrase being used. The IAEA chief, Grossi, recently said the jury is still out on whether diplomacy will actually succeed. President Trump, on the other hand, has publicly sounded more optimistic, stating the U.S. is very close to a solution. So mixed signals there, too.
What are the absolute core sticking points? The things that just keep blocking a breakthrough?
The most intractable one, the issue that seems to stall everything repeatedly, is Iran's demand for the full, permanent lifting of all sanctions, and crucially, international recognition of what they call their nuclear rights, including enrichment.
Enrichment is the key.
It really is. Iranian officials are adamant they will not compromise on their right to enrich uranium under the NPT. They see it as a fundamental matter of national sovereignty. On the other side, you have the U.S. and Israel often demanding a complete dismantle or ban of enrichment, although, as we said, the U.S. has sometimes sent mixed messages about maybe tolerating limited, heavily monitored enrichment.
So it's this fundamental clash. Iran's view of its sovereign rights versus international non-proliferation goals.
It really is. And on that specific issue of enrichment, the sources describe it as being close to a zero-sum game. Neither side feels it can fully back down. That's why talks hit a wall, and why any potential deal that emerges is likely to be more of a temporary, managed compromise rather than a permanent fix that satisfies everyone's core demands.
Are there any new ideas or structures being floated to create and bridge that gap? Compromises?
The sources mention a few possibilities, things like maybe significant U.S. investment in Iran's civilian nuclear program as an incentive, or the idea of some kind of multilateral enrichment organization, maybe involving Middle Eastern nations themselves, plus the IAEA, to oversee any enrichment. Or even, as we touched on, Iran's own proposal for a joint facility with Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
But notably, any proposed New Deal, according to reports, still doesn't include restrictions on ballistic missiles or support for proxies, echoing that old criticism of the JCPOA.
That appears to be off the table for these current, narrowly focused nuclear talks, yes.
So what are the biggest overall challenges then? And maybe, just maybe, any opportunities for actually achieving some kind of sustainable agreement here?
The single biggest challenge, and it's emphasized again and again in the sources, is that profound trust deficit, particularly from Iran's side, stemming directly from the U.S. pulling out of the JCPOA.
They just don't trust the U.S. not to do it again.
Exactly. Iran is deeply, deeply wary of making significant concessions without getting large incentives and durable guarantees in return. Guarantees that any new U.S. commitments won't just be reversed by the next president.
And the Supreme Leader's views are obviously central here.
Absolutely. His deep-seated mistrust of the U.S., his historical resistance to direct talks, these are cited as major obstacles. Add to that, Iran tends to view its nuclear program as integrated with its whole regional security posture, its deterrent strategy. That makes it really hard to neatly isolate it in narrow nuclear-only negotiations.
And then there's the risk of the E3 pushing too hard.
Right, the threat of snapback or strong action at the IAEA board. The sources suggest that risks hardening Tehran's stance and maybe derailing the quiet diplomacy that is happening.
So Iran's demand for durable guarantees isn't just a negotiating tactic. It's a direct result of feeling burned by the U.S. withdrawal.
It seems to be, yes. That unilateral U.S. decision to leave the deal, even when Iran was reportedly complying, it just fundamentally eroded their confidence in any U.S. promise. Without strong assurances that a new deal would be politically durable, binding across administrations, they see making concessions as potentially just setting themselves up to be betrayed again. This issue of trust, of political sustainability, is perhaps the most difficult barrier to any long-term agreement.
Are there any glimmers of hope, any potential opportunities on the horizon?
Well, one potential opening that's noted is the election of the reformist president Masoud Pezeshkian in Iran back in July 2024.
He supports the JCPOA.
He has expressed support for the JCPOA, yes. Now, of course, the Supreme Leader holds the ultimate authority on these matters in Iran. But having a more pragmatic president, one potentially more inclined towards diplomacy, could create a more conducive environment for constructive talks in the future. It's a potential opening, maybe.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, trying to pull it all together, where does this leave us? What's the bottom line?
It leaves us, I think, with Iran's nuclear program at a truly perilous crossroads. That's the phrase that comes to mind. You've got this confluence of factors,
Yeah.
significantly advanced technical capabilities that near zero breakout time, the big stockpile of 60% HEU, that's one side, combined with a confirmed history of clandestine activities, and now the IAEA explicitly finding evidence of that undeclared structured nuclear program in the past.
And the collapse of the JCPOA really acted as a catalyst for the current escalation, and it created those critical blind spots for the IAEA monitors.
Exactly, making effective monitoring incredibly difficult right at the moment it's most needed. And the core diplomatic challenges, they just remain stuck on that fundamental clash. Iran insisting on enrichment rights versus international nonproliferation goals, and Iran demanding those durable guarantees because of that deep, deep trust deficit, especially with the U.S.
And all of this is playing out against this backdrop of really complex, shifting regional dynamics, with key players desperately trying to navigate a path that avoids open conflict.
It really underscores the urgent need, as the sources put it, for some kind of coherent, unified, and pragmatic international strategy. A strategy that can somehow address both Iran's rapidly advancing technical capabilities and this pervasive political mistrust, before the window for nonproliferation, in terms of actually preventing a weapon, closes entirely.
It certainly feels like a race against time, maybe multiple clocks ticking at once, combined with this heavy weight of historical mistrust.
It really does. And maybe here's a final thought, something for you, the listener, to carry forward, building on what we've unpacked from all these sources today.
Okay.
Given Iran's demonstrated capability now to produce weapon-grade material in potentially as little as a week, and knowing from their own archive that they already had the designs and much of the non-nuclear component work for a weaponization program making substantial progress way back in 2003, is the international community's primary concern still solely focused on preventing them from producing the fissile material? Or, perhaps, given how much the technical barriers have diminished, should the equal or maybe even greater concern now be how to prevent the political decision by Iran's leadership to actually assemble and weaponize it? And maybe, what does a truly durable agreement, one that can actually survive political shifts and this profound mistrust, even look like in a world where their breakout capability is already measured in weeks, not years?